welcome. You're watching India Revival Mission on Times Network. I'm Hina Gambhir. Now, this show focuses on solutions and strategies that are needed to reboot the economy. We are in the middle of a pandemic. Corona cases continue to move northwards. We still don't know how far the peak is. But what we know is that Indian job market has been the biggest casualty of COVID-19. And today we are here to have Jobs Ki Baat. We are going to discuss the job market, the job crisis in our country. Joining us on this special broadcast is Mahesh Vyas, Centre for Monitoring Indian Economy, Manish Sabharwal, who is chairman and co-founder team Lease. We have with us Dilip Chenoy, Secretary General, FCCI, and also Ajit Pai, Officer on Special Duty to Vice Chairman NITI Aayog. Welcome, gentlemen, all of you to this very special broadcast. Let me begin this with you, Mr. Mahesh Vyas. CMIE has come out with a report which seems to suggest that at least 50 lakh salaried people have lost their jobs in the month of July. But your report also mentions that there is some bit of a recovery that's being seen. Could you explain to us, what are the trends?
What we have seen is that the total number of jobs that are still lost after the imposition of the lockdown because of the COVID-19 pandemic is of the order of 11 million. So that's what the number was in July compared to the average of 1920. We had a loss of 11 million jobs. But the breakup of this by sectors tells us a slightly interesting story, that there is a big increase in the number of jobs amongst farmers. So there is an increase of 15 million jobs over there. And this makes sense because we have seen that the rainfall this year was good and the sowing was very good. And the Manrega spending by the government to create person jobs has also been very good. Very good means it's double compared to a year ago. So these things have helped increase employment in rural India and in agriculture in particular. On the other side, there's an improvement in jobs for unorganized sector people, those who are informally employed in unorganized sectors. That hit was very large, about 91 million jobs are lost, and most of them have come back. But the gap that we have still got is in salaried jobs. We had lost of the order of 17.7 million jobs in the month of April, which is an immediate impact because of the lockdown. And that has now increased to 18.9 million jobs. So it looks like the jobs have moved towards farming, and there is an improvement in informal jobs, which are self-employed people, but there is stress amongst salaried jobs.
So in a nutshell, what you're trying to suggest to us that the trends are indicating that from the organized sector, we have seen jobs moving to the unorganized sector, to be precise, in the farming sector. Is that sustainable for a country like India?
I wouldn't say that jobs are moving to farm sector. That could be happening at the margin. But there is certainly an increase in employment in farmers, and there is a reduction in the jobs of salaried people. But you're broadly right. I was just making a small technical difference. But your larger question is very valid, that this is not exactly desirable for a country like India, where we have got, into quotes, excess labor in agriculture, which has low productivity there as well. It is important that they move into the industrial sector, the services sector, where productivity is higher.
The most alarming trend probably that you have seen in the last few weeks?
The big loss and the continued loss of salaried jobs. Okay. So this 5 million jobs lost in the salaried structure kind of surprised us, but now we can explain what is going on. You know, the initial shock of the salaried jobs was actually, when we say salaried jobs, it doesn't necessarily mean a person who is going to work in a bank or, you know, in a media company. It is also your chauffeur. He's also a salaried employee, and so is the housemaid. So the initial shock was of these slightly more unorganized or informal jobs of chauffeurs and housemaids and these kinds
Right.
amongst the salaried jobs that lost their job. Now we are seeing the more, into quotes, permanent jobs, those jobs that we visualize as salary jobs, those are getting lost. So I think that is very worrisome.
Mr. Vyas, appreciate you joining us here on this very special broadcast and explaining to us the kind of trends that you have seen in India's job market. You're saying that this loss of jobs for salaried people specifically, that should be the biggest cause of concern. Let's take this forward. Mr. Manish Sabharwal, do you think these trends are worrying?
I don't know whether they're trends yet. I mean, it's too early to say. The data is too noisy. It's like saying unemployment on Sunday afternoon is 75%. I mean, your offices are closed. You can't go to work. So I understand the need for sort of, crystallizing or mattifying the tragedy. But I would submit India doesn't have a jobs problem. We have a wages problem since independence, So employed poverty. So our unemployment rate has been between 6 and 9%. Since independence. And it still is that because of these two shock absorbers called farm employment and self-employment. And so I think our problem is poverty. It is not unemployment. And so I would like to focus on that as a variable. And second is, we don't know what is going on in the labor market till we answer three questions around virus, around demand, and around professions. And virus means, are we at the start, middle, or end of the virus? Demand is, are consumers and companies going to be frugal or hedonistic when COVID ends? I mean, are they going to save for a rainy day or are they going to live for today? And professions, the three fastest growing segment of India's job markets are sales, customer service, and logistics. And if you throw in hospitality and construction, these jobs can't be done with social distancing. So I would say it's just a premature, the noise to signal ratio is really important to remember when dealing with things as large and complex as India's labor market. And, historians warn against a disease called presentism, which is believing that these current circumstances, I think COVID is a passing shower. I don't think it's climate change. So I would be a little more hesitant to say this is a trend. And I would also like to focus more on poverty than on unemployment, or at least underemployment, because that is India's problem. Everybody who wants a job has a job. They just don't have the wages they want and the wages they need. And those are two different problems with two different solutions.
Well, Mr. Sabharwal, you call it a passing shower, but houses are getting inundated. People are unable to come out of their homes as well. There are layoffs that are happening. This problem was always there before COVID as well. Do you believe that COVID has brought it to the limelight and there is an urgent need to address it?
There's been an urgent need to address it for 20 years. I mean, this is a pre-existing condition of the Indian economy. Why are we people so surprised MSMEs or migrants are behaving exactly as you would expect them to behave? So I don't know whether people are paying more attention now. Maybe that's true. Maybe they have nothing else to do. But I would submit that labor reform, compliance reform, education reform, banking reform has been overdue for 10, 20 years. Some people would say for 30, 40. So I would just say that, while it's the presentism of a human tragedy that COVID did is really important, I think it also creates a great policy window for change. Political scientist John Kingdon says the problem, solution, and timing come together. So whatever has happened with COVID, I think it's time to use this as an opportunity to really take an axe through our compliance regime, to really think about raising our credit GDP ratio from 50 to 100, really fixing our education system. So COVID hasn't created anything on labor markets. It has just, as you said, maybe brought it to the front, but it was always there.
It was always there. Mr. Ajit Pai, since last 20 years, as Mr. Manish Sabharwal mentioned, that, this has been a crisis in our country. Why haven't we done enough?
Work in progress for a very long time, but there are several things that have sort of slowed down the process of change as far as this goes. One of them is that we are operating in a federal democracy and in a socialist democracy, And in a process like that, being as decisive as China is very difficult. So there are many steps forward that we take, but then we also take some steps backward. And there are changes when there are changes in government. And what I would say is even the executive that is executing on what the government decides has a certain sort of structure that also would require some reform to accelerate the pace at which we can operate. But I think the points that have been highlighted by both the other panelists so far are valid points. One is that there has been a shift that is away from the longer-term secular trend, away from the formal sector to the informal sector in the recent past. I also don't believe that that's going to last. I think the overall secular trend is towards greater formalization and a shift away from agriculture. We are very highly unproductive in our agriculture. Too many people employed in that sector relative to best practices in the world, where less than 1% of a country can support the entire population in its food needs and the leading sort of best practices in agriculture. But when we have a look at what the current circumstance is, yes, those reforms have to happen, but those reforms in themselves would not be sort of stimulating, growth. We also have to have a strategy as to how we utilize those reforms and ensure that the changes that happen at a pace that can be digested by the economy, and also that the changes that happen result in the creation of jobs in the short run. So two of the areas that I think NITI Aayog has been very focused on right now is obstacles to India becoming more competitive in both manufacturing and services globally. And some of these sectors would include the logistics sector, which has been referred to already, and the infrastructure sector, which would include power and many other components of infrastructure, whether it's roadways, etc., that also feed into logistics. And these are areas, when you look at the construction market and you look at the infrastructure market, these are areas that have a very high employment elasticity, almost 5 to 6 times that of the overall economy. So our focus right now during COVID times is to figure out how to accelerate the investment, not just government investment, but through PPPs in these sectors that will also make India's manufacturing and its services far more competitive globally, where so far we have not been doing that great a job. Now, that said, I think, what has been pointed out, and rightfully, that our compliance burden is extremely high in India, has caught the attention of, I think, of both the executive and I think the political will to change that is there. So when we begin on something that is long overdue, as someone has said, by 15, 20 years, to expect it to be accomplished too quickly would be, I think, would be optimistic. But at least I can see steps being taken in that direction in many, many parts of the government, including the labor codes that are already, in Parliament.
Mr. Dilip Chenoy, why is it that the country has to seek answers from the government each time we are talking about job losses, layoffs? What is it that the private sector has been doing all this while? Why haven't be able to address this issue of job creation?
Your point about jobs and people is a one-sentence answer. In the current scenario, there are jobs without people and people without jobs. It is because of the current scenario where we have had lockdowns, we have on and off lockdowns in different states, that there is no certainty of how the business could be done and when you could operate. That is actually creating a kind of an ecosystem which is leading to what Manish very nicely said is temporal numbers, right? But on the ground, if I were to give you sector by sector, automotive industry today is worried about getting people back for meeting the festive season demand. They are back in some sectors, they're back to 90% of operation. In some other sectors, they're back to 95% of operation. They are worried about getting people. The second sector which I really would like to say was, let us say, the FMCG sector or even the food sector. Even during the lockdown, they were wanting people, and a lot of companies, including a company like Amul, were giving incentives to workers to actually come back and work. So, I think the problem, as depicted by numbers at a broad level, right, is not necessarily what is actually either a sustainable trend or is going to be impacting the economy going forward. If you look at the investment by private sector, the investment, right, most of the interventions that have been done today are supply side. And if you look at the capacity utilization of industry, unless it comes to 75 or 80%, you're not going to have expansion. But yet, if you look at certain sectors like packaging, glass, there are many, many sectors, and the recent incentives announced for the production length incentive for the pharma sector, for the food processing sector, and the other mobile sector. Private sector has created jobs, but the percentage of people actually involved in permanent jobs in the private sector is a minuscule of the 475 million people who are actually employed. So looking at a small percentage to drive the overall numbers is perhaps putting it in a different perspective. So private sector is investing, private sector is expanding capacity, private sector is creating jobs. It's a cyclical nature, and as demand comes back, and the biggest challenge today is about demand. If the demand comes back, then everything would happen. I believe the government is very aware of this fact, and they're looking at which point of time they look at stimulating the demand in those sectors going forward.
Very interesting point was made by Mr. Manish Sabharwal that, there is a window of opportunity for some kind of a policy change. I want to take closing comments from each one of you, gentlemen. Let's begin with Mr. Manish Sabharwal. What is it, that the government, that the private sector can really do to address the structural deficiencies that are there? Couple of suggestions that you can give.
There are three kinds of reforms: institutional reforms, capacity building, and flick of pen reforms. I'll keep myself to flick of pen because in 90 days, you could, out of the 69,000 compliances, 7,000 filings that change 8,000 times a year that corporate India or employers or India are subject to. In 90 days, you could take an axe through this and appoint a compliance commission which says that we will cut 50% of the filings. Most importantly, there are about 18,000 of these 67,000 compliances that prescribe jail. The criminalization of civil offenses really makes India a hostile habitat for job creation, and particularly the factory refugees from China, which are looking to set up new base. So I'd say labor reform, compliance reform, and full implementation of the new education policy, along with banking reform, which is massively expand our credit to GDP ratio in a sustainable way.
Mr. Dilip Chenoy, what are your suggestions?
So I think, first of all, we need bipartisan support to whatever reforms come in. Because there's a perception that if you do something for industry, the reforms will be labeled in a particular manner, and it will not, it will be politically not sustainable to do that. So I think the states and the centers and all political parties should actually understand that if we collectively do this reform and collectively work on, the three types of reform that Manish talked about, it is very, very simple. Just to take Manish's point further about compliance, why can't we just have that you upload a self-certified compliance, and like you have a faceless, painless, and seamless income tax assessment, you implement that. That will just take 30 seconds and one executive order, right? And then industry will have to comply with it. The second thing is that we need, we looked at one nation, one ration card, one roaming, integrating the nation and having one nation, one lockdown policy. So everybody understands what is happening, because in the immediate term, this lockdown, like today, some parts of the country are closed.
Yes.
Right? So we need consistency and uniformity of this, because in the short term, this is what will get us out. And then there's a medium term and long term. I think in the medium term, the government will have to come out with certain demand side interventions and sectoral interventions, because the services sector, which is a significant part of our GDP and also a significant part of the employment numbers, will need to come back and go forward.
Very interesting. Mr. Ajit Pai, I give you the last word.
Both of the panelists that have indicated what those issues are and highlighted what they are, I'm not sure whether they completely appreciate the three tiers of government within India. So you have the center, you have the state, and then you also have the ULB or the PRI. And if we go through that list of sort of compliances that I think Mr. Manish Sabharwal indicated, it might be fairly interesting to see how many of those compliances are central government, how many are state, and how many are sort of local. So when you open a restaurant, or you open a hotel, I think there was the founder of Lemon Tree mentioned that he had 1,600 compliances for his Lemon Tree in Mumbai. When you go through the chunk of those compliances, many of them are local. So while all of those things are desirable, that change has to come across the country. It's not just the central government that can sort of table and consolidate labor laws. It has to happen at the state level. It has to happen at the municipal level. In fact, I would say that while the top down is happening, that bottom up has tremendous potential for it to happen. And there's only so much in our federal democracy that I indicated earlier that the central government can do.
Perhaps
so to your point, I think you need a groundswell of attention drawn to these things. And we need the citizens and the corporate world and the private sector to be trying to push as much of this at the ground level as possible. And NITI Aayog's mandate of what they call cooperative federalism and comparative federalism, we are out here to try and make that happen. So any help that we can get and any suggestions we can get to make these things happen, it is definitely things that we are open to.
All right. Thank you very much, all of you gentlemen, for joining us on this special broadcast. Interesting solutions. And of course, what Mr. Ajit Pai said was also very, very important. In a federal democracy, you have to look at other stakeholders as well. But in this time of coronavirus, the pandemic that we are into, this is the time for everyone to come together, talk about solutions and implement whatever is possible. Thank you very much for joining us on this special broadcast.